Hi, I'm Tony.
I'm Patrick.
And welcome back again to another episode of Cave to the Cross Apologetics. And we are working our way through Greg Koukl's book, Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions. And so we have worked our way up to chapter 12. We've looked at the first section that dealt with this whole idea of the Columbo tactic, right? Where we're asking questions and helping people work through issues. And now he's going through some kind of real practical, stuff to help folks to help us to see and find flaws in other folks' thinking is really what he's getting at here. And so this first couple chapters here has to do with the idea of contradictions, right? And he says this obviously is one of the biggest flaws, and if we can point this out, the person, we can help them to see that their argument is kind of sinking, right, or isn't a good argument. So in the previous chapter, chapter 11, we looked at a couple of versions of this, and now we want to look at two more versions of this notion of contradiction. He calls them sibling rivalry and infanticide, right? So he says, sometimes a conflict arises when a person raises two objections that are at odds with each other, right? Two objections that are at odds with each other. And he calls this sibling rivalry, right? And he thinks it's pretty easy to spot when people do these kinds of things, right? At other times, someone's view is built on a prior concept that turns out to disqualify the view itself. And he calls this infanticide, right? So we'll kind of take a look at these two notions and see if we can understand exactly what he's getting at here. This is kind of some complicated stuff, so we'll kind of take our time as we work through this. So the first notion here has to do with sibling rivalry, right? What in the world is sibling rivalry? Well, he says occasionally in conversations you notice something odd. You hear a pair of objections voiced by the same person, but the complaints are logically inconsistent with each other, right? So here's two objections, but they kind of, they defeat one another. One defeats, so they're logically inconsistent with each other. He says this is kind of like children fighting, right? And so that's the notion of sibling rivalry. Both objections cannot be simultaneously legitimate, right? And so your task here is to cut the deal in half, right?
Whose toy is this? It's mine. No, it's mine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. He said a fair-minded person will surrender at least one of these objections, right, when you identify the problem. Graciously point out the conflict, then ask which one is the real problem, right? And sometimes this move effectively silences both objections because the person that you're talking with realizes that, she's been unreasonable, right? So, for instance, he gives an example here. If homosexuality is morally neutral because it's natural, so notice what makes homosexual okay? Well, because it's natural, so it's morally neutral. Then adoption of children by same-sex couples must be wrong. Why? Well, because for homosexuals, parenthood would be unnatural. So if something is natural makes it okay, then what's unnatural makes it wrong. And since not having children, right? They can't have children would be is a natural state for homosexuals, and so to give them children would be unnatural. So that's kind of the idea here, right? In other words, if nature dictates morality, and the natural consequence for homosexuals is to be childless, then it's unnatural and therefore immoral for homosexuals to raise children. Now, notice the idea here is based on the concept of what makes something moral or immoral, and it's based on nature here, or a natural state, right? And so, wow, right? And so he gives several examples like this to help us to see this sibling rivalry, these two conflicting arguments, and you can't have it both ways.
Right. And so he goes on to give us these examples, and a lot of times he's using kind of moral claims. And again, we said last episode that if you kind of are looking at this from a science perspective or a reason or logic, it may be a little bit harder because you might have to have a little bit more knowledge in those areas. But the problem of evil or morality is one that we, I think, especially in our culture, tend to talk about the most, and especially when it comes to topics like religion. I think more people are willing to talk about kind of the moral claims rather than, does A follow or does B follow from A, or does the conclusions follow the premise, or are the premise sound, are they logical? And so Greg Koukl here gives a lot of examples in this chapter from the moral claim or the problem of evil that we talk about here. And so one of them is called Is Gandhi in Heaven?
Wow.
Yeah. And so kind of to set the scene, he's talking to a Hindu person who wants to say that, heaven would be a very poor place without Gandhi in it, because Gandhi's, this national figure. He did a lot of important things, did a lot of bad things too, but, no one really wants to talk about those. And so kind of going into this, in Hindu theology and Hindu philosophy, evil and good exist as dual poles. If there is no evil, it is impossible to have good. Each must balance the other out. So that's kind of what to know going in here. Mm-hmm. And so he says, well, sir, you must at least believe in heaven then, and apparently you've done some thinking about it. Good. What would qualify someone for heaven? Tell me what kind of people go to heaven. Well, then the response is, well, only good people go to heaven. Okay, so far so good. But this idea of what is good, what makes a person good is very unclear to me. What is good?
Uh-oh.
Mm-hmm.
Now the Hindu is in trouble.
Right. So the Hindu is not immoral, is in not a neutral ground. He's going to revert back to his prior beliefs. And so he's going to say, well, good and bad are relative. There's no clear definition. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Well, here we go. Here's the light bulbs flashing. Here's, where do you want to pick up from? Asking people to define what is good, what is evil, tends to be one of those hot button issues that you can really jump on. And again, you're asking them to provide an answer from their point of view, and so the burden of proof rests on them, as we talked about in the Columbo tactic. So if this is true, that good and bad are relative, and there's no clear definition, then goodness is relative and can't be defined. How is it that you assume Gandhi is good and should be in heaven? So either Gandhi fulfills some external standard of goodness, thus qualifying for heaven, or goodness is relative and therefore a meaningless term when applied to anyone, including Gandhi. Both cannot be true at the same time.
So you're making two contradictory claims,
right?
Right. Then these two siblings then are fighting each other,
right?
Right.
So it's trying to kind of dip its toe. It's speaking outside of claims against itself. So that's what it's doing.
Yeah, good. Another example he gives has to do with this movie, The Quarrel. Now, I haven't seen this movie, but it looks like it might be a good one to
people talking. I enjoy movies about people talking.
So he says, I encountered a clear example of sibling rivalry after an airing of The Quarrel, a film that explored the problem of God and the Holocaust. It was produced by David Brandeis. And he was asked to moderate a discussion, right, about this movie. And so he says, from one side of the auditorium, a Jewish woman offered the idea that maybe God allowed the Holocaust as a punishment for Israel's wayward drift into secularism, right? Some Jewish thinkers have raised, he says, this possibility in the light of promised curses for apostasy recorded in Deuteronomy 28.
And
right,
within the history of
the
the Israelite people, we've seen that with Babylon and the Assyrians. I mean,
right.
that's exactly what happened. Not to like this extent in this certain way, but removing them from the land, the declaration of a remnant coming back and renewing the land. I mean, that's standard Jewish history right there.
Yeah. And so this maybe God allowed the Holocaust as a punishment for Israel's wayward drift into secularism. He says this reflection prompted a sarcastic, well, that's a real loving God, from the other side of the theater. right? And so he says that I call attention to the conflict suggested by the second comment. Those who are quick to object that God isn't doing enough about evil in the world, right? A good God wouldn't let that happen, are often equally quick to complain when God puts his foot down. A loving God would never deliver judgment, right? So God needs to punish, but a loving God wouldn't punish.
Yeah.
Those are two contradictory notions, right? So if God appears indifferent to wickedness, his goodness is challenged. Yet if he acts to punish sin, his love is in question, right? So these objections compete with each other in most cases, and he says this is an example of sibling rivalry. One or the other needs to be surrendered. Both can't be held simultaneously, right? So you need one or the other, and then we can go from there, right? So which one do you want, right? So you kind of again, you point this stuff out by graciously, asking a question: what's your real concern here, right?
And last time we talked about the issue with moral relativists, and moral relativists have this kind of understanding that objective moral truth doesn't really exist, and that kind of what's true for me is true for me, and what's true for you is true for you. And if those two kind of compete against each other, well, then you're just in competition, and you have to figure out some way of, I don't know, interacting, or a utilitarian point of view, or
it's
something.
okay, if that's morally right for you, then that's fine. That's just morally right for you.
It's okay for me to punch you in the nose and you to take it. Okay, so sibling rivalry is a type of self-destruction for moral relativists when they object to the problem of evil. So what's this problem of evil? Well, the Odyssey is, how do we deal with evil in the world if there's this good God that supposedly is out there? And, how can you allow such evil and suffering and bad things to occur? Well, there's a lot of good points to that, and some books being written by author of Scott Christensen, who was on our show previously. He's finished up a book on just this subject alone, so hopefully we'll have him back on when he's ready to release the book. So he has a conversation with a person at a restaurant, and at first she talked like a relativist. Everyone has his own morality. Right and wrong is a private affair. Who's to judge? And he says, as their conversation ranged over other topics, though, the problem of evil came up. How could a God exist when there's so much evil and suffering in the world? So he says, I want you to know something about the problem of evil. The entire objection hinges on the observation that evil exists out there as an objective feature of the universe. And this is a serious problem for relativists. So according to relativism, when someone uses the word evil, he's expressing a personal preference, though.
So it's in there. It's the individual.
So which one is it? Is it out there, or is it in here?
Right. Is it objective, or is it subjective?
Right. So strictly speaking, the person is not talking about what they're actually talking about. The relativist is talking about himself. So, it's if you're referencing something that's out there, what the moral relativist should be doing is referencing internally. So to me, it's wrong. Right.
You can't say it's just wrong.
It's wrong out there.
It's just objectively wrong. It's wrong independent of what anybody thinks. You can't hold that as a moral relativist, right? Because the moral relativist says it's me, right? I determine what is morally right and wrong. It's not out there.
Right. So if relativism were true, talk of evil as an objection to God's existence would be nonsense. The complaint would mean nothing more than, if God were really good, he wouldn't allow things that I don't like. Right. And you see a lot of people arguing with this. Well, if God is real, he wouldn't do this. He wouldn't make the giraffe with this type of internal blood thing like Dawkins wants to do. Well, okay, sure. Well, you be God, and then you can make the giraffe however you want to. There's a quote here he has from C.S. Lewis that says, of course, he summed it up this way. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own relativism. But if I did that, then my argument against God would collapse too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. Right. And so when we talk about things like justice and truth and goodness and badness, we tend to ultimately appeal to things out there. So someone should be punished for this. Well, why? First, we got to go to that person and see if it's wrong for them. Then, if they allow themselves to be punished for it, then we can ask them to allow us to punish them for it, right? That's what we should do. But no, we talk about things like, murder and rape and torture and all those different examples that come upon us when we're talking about moral claims. We talk about things like, well, how do we establish justice? In what way do we render justice here on earth in this time? We talk about justice reform, and we talk about all these things that have to do with prison systems and different modes of punishment and how it's changed over time. And so there, it's kind of appealing to a standard by not just might makes right, but we're appealing to a form of natural justice, justice that exists out in the world that we're trying to define and bring in, and secularly within the scope of the law, we're trying to discover capital L, the law.
And of course, the moral relativist can't hold the position, doesn't hold the position that it's out there.
Right.
Any values are out there.
Yeah.
They're all in here.
Right. The lowercase l. So there's where the sibling rivalry comes into play. Capital L, the law, is out there, and we're trying to discover it. But really, lowercase l, law is within each of us, and so we should discover what fits our fancy. And so when we talk about things like justice, and we have a sense of that person should be punished, we're holding incongruent views there. And so which one wins out? Right. And that's what we want to ask. That's where our Columbo questions gets that person to ultimately say, am I a 7'2" Asian female that is 6 years old? And you've seen that a lot on campus reforms videos, and where they go out to college campuses and ask those questions and say, can I believe this? Well, you can believe it if you want to. Okay, but is it truthful? Well, it's true for me. And so that's where it starts kind of spiraling down, and you see that. And there are legitimate repercussions that happen from holding these viewpoints. And so within the scope of our determination of faith and truth about religious claims, asking these questions is where we're going to kind of get the most bang for our buck. It's going to come up, and so this is a kind of a proper way to deal with it, again, so that no one gets angry. You're pointing out flaws within the person's point of view that they're bringing to you, and you're having a dialogue rather than a monologue. So that's what we're doing here.
And so he says here, to say that something is evil is to say that it's not the way that it's supposed to be, right? So there's a standard is really what he's getting at here. So he says this makes no sense unless things are supposed to be different, right? Or there is a way that things are supposed to be, right? Yet this is what the relativist denies. There isn't a way, universally, objectively, that things are, morally speaking, that the way things are supposed to be, right? They're what each individual believes that they are in terms of morality. And so the problem here then is that when you make these types of claims, God is why, God is evil, basically is what you're saying, right? Why would a loving God do this kind of thing? If you're a moral relativist, morality is subjective, but you're trying to make evil, another value, objective. And so now you have these two siblings at rivalry, right? They're fighting each other, right? So either it's objective or it's subjective, but it can't be both, right? That's the idea. Morality is either objective or it's subjective, can't be both. There's huge problems, as we pointed out last time, with morality being subjective, right? It's only what I think, right? And so, but it can't be both. It can't be subjective and objective. And so you need to point this out and ask people, what do they really mean, right?
It's subjective, and that's just the way things are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Then you can't say that anybody's action, even God's, are evil.
Right.
They may be evil to you, but that's your opinion.
Yeah.
Right.
God has more might, so he's more right. There you go.
Yeah.
So then we turn to the second portion here of self-destruction. So this is the kind of the fourth form, but the second one within this chapter, and he terms it infanticide. And I think he's using these terms so that it'll stick in your mind. Right. So he says, at times, someone's view is built on a prior concept that turns out to disqualify the view itself. This is called infanticide. And so he kind of gives us this illustration to kind of pull it forward. So sometimes objection is dependent on a prior notion that must be in place before the challenge is offered. And so it's like saying that a father sends his son a letter that says, "Son, if you didn't get this letter, please let me know and I'll send another. I made a copy." So, okay. How's the son supposed to reply to that if you never received it?
Yeah.
You go to class and the substitute comes in and says, "Okay, raise your hand if you're not here." Okay, hold on. So sometimes the objection, the child who gets the letter, is dependent on a prior notion, the parent, that must be in place for the challenge to be offered. Yeah. And so that's what we're going to be covering here.
Right. So this one is kind of, you got to think this one through, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you have these, so one claim is based on another, and if the claim defeats the one it's based on, just the opposite, right? One claim is the basis of a claim, the other of another claim. And so if the basis defeats the claim that you're making, you've killed off the child claim that's based on the other claim, right? And so he calls this infanticide. So he's going to give us several, examples here to help us to understand what's going on here. For instance, he talks about bowling. We'll look at that one first, right? He says, most powerful example of infanticide that I know has to do with the problem of evil, but before we get there, we'll look at the complaint, we'll look at this question with regard to bowling. Is that what he does first here, I think, or does he jump right in there?
So he talks about how knowing the difference between a mediocre and a masterful score in bowling is important. And so, if someone says that the person who knocks down the most pins wins, it's not really how it's done; it's the score that counts, right? Mm-hmm. But so you have to kind of understand that it's not how the ball spins or what clothes you're wearing; it's the number of pins that get knocked down. And so to understand that 300 is kind of the masterful score, that every pin has to be knocked down in every frame. But if you're a golfer, one stroke per hole is what makes you masterful. And so understanding those kind of competing, those rules, you then understand what it means to be good.
Right. And so what he's getting at here is there must be a standard. Right. You have to have a standard. In bowling, the standard, the best you can do is 300, right? In golf, it's,
right. Having 300 is a bad score.
Yeah. Right. So that's what he's getting at with regard to this bowling illustration.
Right. So first of all, understand the rules.
Yeah, you have to understand the rules, and you have to have a standard in order to say that something is good or bad. You need a standard to determine that. Right. That's the basic idea here. Right. And so he says the most powerful example of infanticide has to do with the problem of evil. Mm-hmm. First question the atheist must answer is, what do you mean by evil?
Right.
What do you mean by evil?
Right. So typically, if you're talking about with somebody, they might say something like, well, God can't exist because there's all this evil in the world, or God can't exist because he would be the most evil person in the entire world to flood the earth.
Right.
Okay. Hold on. We skip to the child. We need the parent definition first to understand where we're coming from when we judge God's existence based on evil. Right. What is evil? Right.
So you need the standard. That's the parent, right, in order to have the child.
Right.
Right. And
what are the rules?
And so the atheist's impulse is to give examples of evil. Murder, torture, oppression, that's what evil. No. That misses the point, right? Why call these things evil to begin with? Why are these things evil, right? We must first know what evil is before we can point to examples of it. Mm-hmm. So you don't let them get away with giving you examples. You want to know, okay, well, why is that evil? Right. Again, we're looking for the standard.
Right. So the atheist first must answer the question, where does the moral scoring system, like we talked about in bowling or golf, where does the moral scoring system come from that allows one to identify evil in the first place? Right. So again, what is evil? Is it out there? That we talked about with moral relativism, is it out there? And so there's an objective standard that's independent from humanity, or is it internal And so what do you mean by calling someone else evil? Like, that's just your personal preference, right? Yeah. So what do you mean by that's evil?
I like chocolate, you like vanilla, somebody else likes strawberry. Right. Okay, fine,
I like people, you don't like people. That's fine. We should be all fine with that, right? Where's the transcendent standard, that's above us, of objective good that makes the whole notion of evil intelligible? So there again, it's not just evil's out there, but also good is out there. So to even claim that there is no good, there's only evil. Well, if something's if something is evil, is there then objectively something that's good? Are moral laws that are they product of chance? Did they just kind of come up in the world and water is wet and murder is wrong? If so, why obey them? You can always go against moral claims, right? Yeah. People murder people. So clearly there's no, I don't believe in gravity. No, I'm still here. I'm not floating around. But I can say, I don't believe in that murder is evil, and go out and murder somebody, or murder of that person in this circumstance.
Right. In other words, who establishes how things are supposed to be, right? Yeah. For the moral relativists, it's each individual. So what you're trying to do then is press this on the atheist, right? Where do you get your standard, right? This is really a presuppositional argument.
Absolutely. Yeah. The Big Bang occurred, and murder being wrong swirls out there at the speed of light and comes to rest within the scope of the entire universe except for behind Jupiter, right? So we can go murder people behind Jupiter. Oh, or is it all universal? Well, if it's all universal, where is it? Can you show it to me? Can I test it? Does science allow me to see that murder is evil? Or is it just a claim? And so it's not really evil. It's just personal preference that I have against it. And so I can get into groups of people that also view it as such, and we can have the most pointy sticks, and whoever has the most pointy sticks, we don't want people to murder people, or else we'll murder them. So right. Therefore, it's okay for us to murder people.
And so there seems to be no good way to account for a transcendent, objective standard of good, right? The moral rules that are violated by people who commit evil in question, without the existence of a transcendent moral rule maker, right? And so that's what he's really getting at here, right? You have to have something that's transcendent, that transcends each individual perspective, that's independent of each individual perspective, in order to have a particular standard that's more than just each individual perspective. Right.
So going back to the bowling example, we have to know that the rules have been written by somebody or something. Right. I guess. Bowling just came about through natural selection. And so, maybe knocking down all the pins is incorrect. Maybe 299 is the score to get. You're that masterful that you leave everything but one pin up. That's what a true master would do. Not knocking things down is easy, right? Yeah. I mean, bombs do that, but to leave one up, that's the good one. Well, how do you know that? You have to understand that there's kind of the rules in place, and how do we understand those rules? Well, obviously the Bible talks about those things, and we can bring that into the conversation when we talk to people. So if someone says, well, where do you think evil comes from? Yes, we're there. We're there. All right.
So notice that there's nothing in the universe that's higher than human beings, then obviously what's morality?
Right. So
it's a matter of opinion. Really is what it is, right?
Yeah. So to say something is evil, that's the child claim. But if you say there's what I mean by evil is personal preference, well then you've infanticide. You've killed the child. You've killed that initial question. Right. So you've gotten at the base, and so, like Tony was saying, these are our presuppositions, what we hold prior to our understanding of certain things.
Right. Yeah. Now we need to say at this point, because we're going to get 1,000 objections, right?
Well, of course.
There are various ways that atheists attempt to get around this issue. And if you refer to Mitch Stokes' books, he deals with most of these, actually the most important ones, right? And so we won't take the time to go into that, but I refer you to his book was...
How to be an atheist.
How to be an atheist, right? Yeah. So go take a look at that, and even look at our series of walking through that book, and he'll deal with these other objections that they have. But the basic idea here is that a morally perfect God is the only adequate standard for the system of scoring, right? That's the basic idea. and if we're going to make sense of evil.
Right. And so ironically, then evil does not prove atheism.
Right.
In fact, it proves just the opposite. There can only be a problem of evil if God exists. Right. So to say this isn't how it should be. Should, oughts and shoulds. Those are the warning signals that Nancy Pearcey talks about too. Yeah. Oughts and shoulds, can't have those in a subjective universe. So this is the way that it shouldn't be. So that means that there's a way that it should be. Well, how do we get to the should? Is there other shoulds? Is there other oughts? Is there? And then who provided for those? Does the universe just pop them into existence? Can they pop out of existence? Another thing that Mitch Stokes talked about too. Yeah. So see how all these books are working together. Weird. So since God must exist to make evil intelligible, right? To understand even what evil is, God must exist. Evil cannot be evidence against God. Right. A complaint commits infanticide. Now, you could probably say, I hate God for those things, right? That's what you do. But to say he doesn't exist because of them, that doesn't follow.
Right. Good, yeah. And so using infanticide, we see the notion of morality with its corresponding concept of evil rest upon the prior foundation of God's existence, right? So you got to have that foundation, that's the parent, in order to even come up with a standard to determine good or evil. And if you don't have the foundation, then you kill off the child of the notion of what is good and evil. God exists seems to be necessary in order for any conversation about evil to be coherent. Thus, it can never be used to refute God, the problem of evil he suggests here, because without God, the objection would have no meaning. Right? Because there is no standard, so there is no meaning of right and wrong in this situation. So how could you say anything is evil? Right? What do you mean by evil?
Right. So that's where the second proposition gets killed by the initial one.
So the objection here, and I want you to deal with this because he deals with this right here, is so are you saying then that atheists can't behave good?
Right. What do you mean by that? Right. So sometimes, and I really only heard this from the other side. So I've never actually heard a Christian espouse this, but I'm sure it's happened, right? You probably think of someone that's like, I would never trust an atheist to be in office because they cannot be moral.
Yeah.
Well, okay, if you define, if you can say that morality is subjective and you talk about that, okay, I may be able to buy that logic. But what this does not mean is it doesn't mean that an atheist cannot behave morally. Right. The issue is whether he can make sense of morality in the universe, whether there's a grounding for it. Right. And so this isn't to say that.
So this is a foundational issue. This is this isn't a behavioral issue. This is where do I get the foundation for it, right?
So he says here, gravity still works even when people have no explanation for why it works, right? Even before we came up with the concept of gravity, it still pertained to us. and again, the Bible talks about the law being written on our heart. Why do we act morally? Why do we have a sense of a concept of right and wrong or of justice or wanting to find improvement? Well, it's not just for the sake of doing it. It's because it's been bestowed upon us as image bearers of God that we do those things. Yeah. And so it doesn't mean that atheists, those who don't believe in God, can't make sense. In fact,
can't act morally.
Right, can't act morally. Yeah. In fact, the Christian worldview explains that. So it has explanatory power. Yeah. And so if we have a kind of a universal sense of right and wrong, atheist doesn't really have that claim. It has no grounding. That's where the issue of the grounding problem comes into play. Atheism is a physicalist system that does not have the resource to explain a universe thick with non-physical things like moral obligations, numbers, the laws of logic. That our words produce claims, you're safe, or I now pronounce you man and wife. Okay, those are non-physical things. That's where kind of the scientism comes
created
in.
a marriage out of nothing. Yeah. Poof, right?
Look at that. The Big Bang.
So where do we go with this, right? What's the tactical goal of this particular issue with regard to these self-contradictory notions and statements? He says what we want to do is to show the person that there is a fatal inconsistency in his or her beliefs, and that he or she would correct it if he really understood it, right? That's really what we're trying to say,
That's
right?
the goal.
We're saying, there's some inconsistency here, and so let me help you to see that, because, so that you can correct that, right? Furthermore, the contradiction suggests that deep down, notice the person really doesn't believe everything that they say they believe, because they can't believe both of these things, right? And be coherent, right? And so they have to believe at least one, so they don't believe everything that they're saying they believe. So, for example, when he says there's no truth, he actually believes that there is some truth, right? There has to be some truth, all right, in order to say that, right? But it is doubtful about others, right? Probably the one that you're talking with him about, right? So he believes some truth, but it's doubtful about other truths, right?
So we can see here that the self-destruction tactic is not an end in and of itself, right? There's more that we want to get from the person or take them with, but it can be used as a bridge to further questions. And so we talked about some of those things. So, don't just leave them with, there's no objective good or evil. We can talk about those things, and we can use kind of the Columbo tactic to get there. What kind of evidence is adequate to give us confidence that something is true? Under what circumstances might we legitimately oppose our morality on someone else? And those are questions that we ask, for society too. And so, there are ability to, or there's attempts to want to be consistent. And so you kind of have different philosophies like Ayn Rand's objectivism. It attempts to pull from a natural law, but it just supposes it doesn't say where the objective reality comes from. It has issues with there, but at least it's attempting to ground itself in an objective reality. So what kind of evidence is adequate to give us confidence that something is true? Under what circumstance might we legitimately impose our morality on someone else? Do those circumstances apply here? Yeah. Right.
So those are the types of things that we try to work through with regard to these various contradictory statements, right? This self-destruction that statements like these and arguments like these have, right? And so that's what he's getting at here, especially in this second part with finding the flaws. Right.
And I think too here, when it comes to internal critiques, understanding kind of which one is which and being able to classify them within the scope of the conversation that you're in, I don't think is as important as just being aware of looking at what people are saying and trying to see if there are underlying claims that they're presupposing, or if they're holding two views that are in contradiction to each other. And so I don't think you have to say like, oh, okay, this is more of a formal claim, or this one's more practical. I think it's enough just to, those are good to do within the scope of kind of practice and getting a bunch of examples and trying to classify them.
In other words, you don't need to be able to label them.
Yeah, you don't have to say, well, what you're actually doing is a practical example of but having this internal critique, I think, is very important, especially why? Because the burden of proof rests on them. They're trying to build a house in front of you. And so if they're attempting to make a house with walls but no foundation, then you want to point it out to them. You want to say, hey, hold on, I don't think you're doing this correctly. Right. Let me ask you, what might you be missing here? So using those questions, dialoguing with them, not just saying, hey, you're doing it wrong, dummy. Might not be the best way to say. Also, I want to talk to you about a loving God that wants to have a personal relationship with you,
dummy.
I'll gladly take that moniker on. So I'll be a fool to the Greeks there. Continuing on next time, we're talking about taking the roof off, which is apropos to the house motif here.
Yeah.
So hopefully you join us next time, and let us know if you've been enjoying the book. And I've seen a few of you pick it up. I know, because I get notifications for that stuff. So thanks for doing that. That's appreciative. I'm sure Greg Koukl likes that we're reading his book as well. And check out his stuff, Stand to Reason, and you'll find a lot of good stuff over there as well. So thanks for continuing to like us and watching us, listening to us, and just supporting us. Patreon.com/Cave of the Cross is always appreciative, and we thank you for
subscribing. Everything that you do is helpful.
The things that we do in normal day life now. All right,
See you next time.